Good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth in our series, Leadership Lessons in Troubled Times. This free online series is brought to you by the Schulich Executive Education Centre, or SEEC. My name is Robert Lynn, and I am the moderator for today. This afternoon's topic is Leadership Lessons, the Future of Branding Post-Covid-19. Joining us this afternoon are David Kincaid, founder and managing partner of Level 5 Strategy, and Ian Gordon, the Senior Vice President of Loblaw Brands. They will be interviewed by Alan Middleton, SEEC's Executive Director. To ask questions during the fireside chat, please use the chat function at the bottom of your computer screen. We are video recording this session for our video library. Now, let's get started. I would like to hand over to my colleague, Alan Middleton.
Welcome, everybody. I have with me today, as their pictures and profiles come up, two of the top experts on brands and brand business in the country. And actually, I've known them for a while, so I would say even the continent, if not the world. Ian Gordon, in his present role, manages one of Canada's top regarded brands in President's Choice. But his ancestry, even though he looks young and approachable, his ancestry goes back to some of the great Unilever brands as well. David Kincaid is the managing partner of Level 5, but before that he did great brand work at Chorus Entertainment, Labatt's, and for those of you a little bit older, a company called General Foods, which was one of the dominant packaged goods companies at the time. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
We will have a fairly free discussion. The first little bit will be my questions to them, and because the two of them have known each other a while, I will just ask them which one wants to go first, and everybody will interrupt everybody else. We'll do that for about 15, 20, 25 minutes. Then I'll go to our chat box and start bringing in questions from you, the audience. So make sure you ask some good questions. So I'm going to break this into sort of two levels. Firstly, what should brands be doing now at the moment? And then we'll move on to how they will set up for the future. And just a little bit of elaboration on that. You know, one of the things we've seen after the initial COVID period in March was the panic, everybody else getting ready. And now we're getting a better sense of how people are going and moving on. Not perfect, still uncertainty. But through all this, what should brands be doing? What should they be thinking about? So, gentlemen, what is on your minds for what brands should be doing? Either one.
Well, I'll jump in. It's the tough question to be asking right now, right?
Of course.
Because brand managers, by the very nature of their DNA, like to have answers and like to be able to look into the future with some degree of certainty and make good plans. We're not in a position to be able to do that. And it's as, people have said it's once in a generation. I hope it's once in many generations. But I think people have to step back, brand owners have to step back and understand the true enormity of the level of change that's going to come out of all of this. And, past crises that we've all dealt with, take 08, the financial crisis, 01 after the terrorist crisis, we all managed to deal with them, but this is not a financial crisis. It's not caused by, only economic factors. This is societal, this is health. This is, yes, of course, it's obviously financial, but this has got much greater overarching impacts. And I think, first of all, you've got to step back and recognize you don't have the answers. So learn how to ask good questions, number one. Number two, and then I'll turn it over to Ian, but I view this as glass half full. I'm trying to live in a world of optimism right now, but a glass half full as opposed to glass half empty. And I think true progressive, responsible brand owners are taking this opportunity to, yes, batten down the hatches to make sure the business that they are responsible for stays afloat and stays viable and keeps its employees and its customers safe and healthy. But it's also an opportunity as a result of maybe some of that time that you've got to think about longer term questions as well as the immediate short term. And I put the challenge out to the senior leaders of these brand driven organizations. What are you doing with maybe some of that extra time? It's a great opportunity.
Is there extra time?
Yeah, well, hopefully there is, if they've got the right team underneath them doing with the batten down the hatches. But, you know, are you asking core questions, our purpose, the values of the organization? Given that enormity of the change, chances are you're going to have to be changed to some degree out that back end. And now's the time to be asking those longer term questions, not just staying focused, looking at our toes, dealing with the P&L and cutting budgets.
So, Ian, is that what you're doing with all your extra time?
Well, it's interesting because
aside from growing,
lots of extra time.
I think, a beard.
Yeah, I think, you know, my message would be in these times, I think it's really important to resist the temptation to move to action. And I say that because you see a lot of brands in the marketplace right now recognizing an obligation and a desire to do something in the marketplace, saying, I want to come out and reassure the public. But if it's not relevant and it's not true to the core purpose of what your brand stands for and is all about, you run the risk, I think, and we see it a lot in the communication out there. I mean, how many people have gotten a please stay safe, we're thinking of you from your lawn sprinkler company? You haven't talked to them in years. And they're putting out a message more through obligation than thinking about it from their brand perspective. And I think building on David's point about batten down the hatches, there's different parts of the organization that have really been mobilized throughout the home isolation. And they've been working 24/7. I think of our organization, the DCs, the store workers, et cetera, et cetera. Our role as brand owners and brand guardians is when the sense of urgency and a new sense of calm or the new normal starts to break through, everybody in the organization is going to turn to us and say, okay, how do we move on now into the new world? What have you learned? What are we doing differently? How do we re-engage the consumer in the new normal?
Yeah. There's some research coming out of the US, which is totally contradictory, like your viewpoints on it. So I'm getting signals saying the internet's doing funny things, so I'll keep going. And it says that this is going to people or brands that have delivered value in the past. They should be able to reap the rewards because they're there and they're trusted. But then there's other research that says if brands don't step up and do that well, there's a new searching around by the consumer in a new environment for new alternatives. Let me throw it at Ian first. Ian, what are you seeing? And then over to David.
It's funny because I see both of those things and I don't see them as mutually exclusive. You know, we talk a lot about brands and trust and building trust in brands, and it doesn't really seem like I have a sense of urgency. I want to build purchase intent. I want to build repeat purchase. But trust is what you use in uncertain times. And I think who you're going to see coming through this situation most effectively are those brands that have built trust in the past. And it's like a bank account. You have equity in your trust. In uncertain times, you go to that trust like a bank account to get money, and you can spend that equity in troubled times. So I think, you know, if ever there's been an example of why it's important to build trust in your brand with your core consumer group, I think the current situation is absolutely an example of how we've been able to do that.
Yeah.
And so,
David?
sorry, and the second piece,
Yeah,
Okay, keep going in. Oh, we're having a few internet problems.
sorry, David's locked out.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
and I
you keep
think
going for a
moving
second, Ian.
forward
We'll get David
is,
back in.
okay. I think moving forward is really, and again, I sort of talked about this at the start, is really understanding your brand and how it's relevant to the consumer as we move through this, and how's it going to be relevant in the future as we move out of this and the consumer purchase habits change. I think, you know, one thing that is critically clear to me is, particularly from a consumer packaged goods perspective, when you walk into the grocery store, my Heinz ketchup isn't on the shelf. I've had to reevaluate my purchase decision. And we know that brands facilitate the consumer to make decisions faster. I have a brand in my portfolio. I trust that brand. I can make that purchase decision quickly. As we've gone through this, Heinz ketchup might not have been on the shelf. So I might have tried a different type of ketchup. I might have tried a different brand. And all of a sudden, the consumer purchase decisions have all been thrown up in the air. And a lot of them are open to be reevaluated because the bond that the brands have broken, sometimes with little trust or the strength wasn't that strong, that purchase decision has been broken and is open for reintroduction. So I see moving out of this, there's never been a better time in terms of people reevaluating purchase decisions and our opportunity to engage them in a relevant way with a brand that is unique and highly differentiated, then I can now build a relationship with that consumer moving forward out of this.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, going back to your question, our friends, all deference south of the border, I don't think it's an either or. You know, kind of what Ian's saying, you're not going to build brand trust and brand equity in the space of 3 or 4 weeks because of a pandemic. That equity existed or it didn't as a result of your consistent delivery of your brand's promise in the market for an extended period of time. So I think those brands that have got that existing brand equity have a bit of a favored nation status and a competitive advantage as a result. But because of the realities of product shortages, because of the change in the retail environment, regardless of whether it's groceries or clothing or anything else that you need to shop for, if my trusted brand is not there, or if, hey, look, I've got $100 less in my wallet this week to be able to cover my groceries, and I've got 3 kids to feed, I might be willing to try other products / brands that provide an immediate value capability. So I do think, though, that the preference is for brands that I trust, that existing equity, but you got to keep investing in that in the proper way, in the new normal, because these value alternatives are just stronger alternatives than they might have been in the past.
Goes back to something you both talked to Ian, particularly just earlier, which is, you know, the wave of communication that's out there saying, you know, we're supporting the frontline workers and stay at home, be good, all of which is good. But if it just sits there as a general promise without linking it back to what the brand is about, then there's minimal value. One of our earlier sessions had John Doig, who's head of consumer banking at Scotiabank. And he made the comment that he said, we care about our customers deeply, we care about our staff deeply, but we're bankers, we're not healthcare people. And that's what we need to help people about, being good bankers within there. So that's very much what you're saying. But you need to innovate within that, don't you? Because there is this new world. So an old trusted brand with fixed behavior in the old way needs to think about how that brand's going to be used in a new way. How do you think your way through that?
Sorry, David, let me just, I want to highlight something Alan said that I thought was really, really interesting. I think a brand that did a really good job of it would be Dove and their thanking of healthcare workers. And we know that Dove pre-COVID was about inner beauty and about celebrating people. And their ability, and that's what I talked about earlier, they could actually reach out to their consumer in a way that's consistent with what they're all about and have a very relevant message in terms of thank you to the healthcare workers. And I thought that is one brand that has done a really good job because their brand purpose is synonymous with what is happening right now, and it became relevant then for the consumer. So I thought they did a very
Great
good job
example.
from that perspective.
Yeah, great example. Yeah.
Yeah,
David?
and I with not because Ian's our other guest, but I've been touting Loblaws as a brand that I have thought from the very beginning has done a very good job of staying true to its DNA, helping Canadians live better lives. 6 months ago, that might have had more of a nutritional and a food innovation and selection kind of a focus to that definition. Living better lives today is about quality food in a safe, clean environment. And the way Galen Weston has reached out as the leader of that organization, the true brand ambassador, they've been smart. They own the largest database in the country, aside from the government, and they've used that database to reach out to individuals, not big blanketed messages. Yes, they do television, but I think the effectiveness has been the way they've been able to have this steady stream of contact and communication, almost as though you're talking to me about what you are doing for me, all about helping me live a better life. And they've piled up a lot of firsts as well. Another couple of quick examples, Kraft, I think, has done a very interesting job of taking their media buy and saying, we're going to donate that to small business, local business. So they've gone out and allowed, entrepreneurs and small businesses to do a handheld video and use their purchased time. They're not looking for make goods, they're actually donating the time. And I thought that was a really strong dedication and commitment of that brand. And the last one I'd point to, and sometimes it's a matter of being first, not always the best. A small brand that many of you might not have heard of, Home Trust. They actually started to do thank you, like full page ad saying thank you, but to all frontline workers. It wasn't just the healthcare workers. It was the people in the grocery stores. It was, the attendants and the firemen, everybody that is involved as a frontline employee. They were the first to kind of go out and say, when we say thank you to our frontline workers, it's all of you. And I thought that had, for a pretty small media buy, a lot of impact.
Let's shift the gear a little to the future. Now, you've already given one clue and cue about the future and how you take the brands, because we don't know what it's going to look like. So one of the things we've got to do is to stay in touch. So can you talk a little bit about how you're feeling, what I call the rhythm of the market? There's a lot of people doing leisure marketing, doing surveys out there of how consumers are responding. I just inherited a bunch of how consumers are responding in Germany, Malaysia, China, and the UK. Very interesting cultural differences. The Malaysians are buying anything that makes them feel happy, and the Chinese are doing the same. The Germans are going back to more trusted ways. So what kind of things are you seeing, and what should the brand owner do to try to fathom the way out through this uncertain future?
Well, David mentioned it in the start to his discussion today, is I think you have to take everything you were planning to do before March 14th and scrap it and start looking again. And then to weave back into some of the common themes here, as you move forward, do you really understand your brand, and how does your brand become relevant in the new situation? And I think your point is a good one, Alan, in that lots of different consumer groups are reacting in lots of different ways. And again, it's something I think that we lose sight of quite often as we try to build brand and brand equity, but it's who really is the target that we want, and how are they behaving in the new world, and getting out and understanding how those folks are behaving, and then tying it back to how do I build trust over time within the brand and the equity. And I think sometimes we get too caught up in we have to do stuff, we have to get out, we have to respond to a situation, instead of taking the time to say, how is it relevant to my consumer group, and how does it deliver a consistent message for me?
Yeah, nicely. David?
Yeah, I don't jump to conclusions because we don't have the answer. Going out and asking different questions and finding out how that marketplace has changed. You know, the three of us have all talked for many years about the important role of emotions and the emotional equity of a brand, not just the rational equity of a brand. And I think safe to say, going back to my initial comments of the enormity of what we're all living through, this is a hugely emotional time. I mean, just look at the stats on mental health. And I think most great brands deliver a tangible, functional benefit, but especially, you know, at level 5, we really always say 50% of what drives, minimum 50% of what drives a brand's equity are emotional attributes, and they're hard to understand. All we can say is we know they're changing. Even some of the work that we've been doing with clients, you know, prior to the epidemic, you always had brands who had attributes and emotional drivers around being inspiring and fun and interesting and kind of living the contemporary world. We've started to see those emotional drivers migrate to things that are more about knowledge, trustworthiness, familiarness, familiarity, nurturing. Like, I want a brand that cares about me as much as excites me. And it's not an either or. Again, we come back to it's a balance, but this whole side of the equation around nurturing and familiarity, it was not something that was critical in the past, and I think it is going forward. So you got to ask new questions because the world's changed.
Good. I'm going to start.
I also think, Alan,
Ian, go ahead.
Just to build on David's comments, I think too there's a bit of a danger in coming out of this and saying this is how the consumer is going to behave in the future, because we've just spent 9 weeks of anxiety, uncertainty, to David's point, heightened emotions, adrenaline pumping through people, not knowing when we will come out of this, concerned about your health, concerned about the health of your family, concerned about the health of people in long-term care homes. When we come out of this and get into the new normal, there will be knock-on effects and impact down the road that I'm not sure you'll be able to see immediately coming out of this. So again, that's why I think David, you know, very astute point around, don't react too quickly coming out of this and say, hey, the research all says this is how the consumer is going to behave differently coming out of this, because I don't think anybody really knows, ourselves included. How does it affect you personally as you spend time? Well, you're in your office there, I can see, but you know, for me, I've spent the last 8 weeks in the basement. You know, how does that impact you coming out? How do you change? How does that impact your purchase decisions, your habits? What's important to you now? What's important today or in 3 months is going to be very different than what was important to you on March 14th. I mean, on March 14th, what was important was celebrating St. Patrick's Day. And all of a sudden that seems so pointless 8 weeks later. And so I think, you know, it's a good point, is ask the questions about the future and what's the impact of the impacts of this.
Plus the big economic change. So I'm going to go to Jennifer Menard, to all panelists. Being a very niche service, I'll ignore that part. Are you suggesting that we simply use the existing trust and client base we built for our brand to pivot to other services? Or create a new name and a brand to talk about those new services. Otherwise, it might confuse. So really, it's about brand stretchability. So what do you think in answer to Jennifer?
Well, I think step one is understand what those drivers of your current brand equity are. And if you don't understand those emotional and rational that we just talked about, if you don't understand what they are, don't pivot, because you don't know what you're pivoting from and to. But if you do understand what that equity is, and it offers up the opportunity to extend your services to new clients by leveraging what you own and what your brand's DNA has come to represent in the marketplace and what the market values, by all means. But don't do it foolishly. Don't just assume that, wow, everything's changed, I better go and change everything and, you know, come up with a new brand. That really would not be the smart first move.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would concur. I think, David, you know, brands are tough to build, really tough to build. But one thing that I learned really early on, I think that got hammered home for me is, to David's point, if you understand what you're about and what your core essence is, as you pivot, where you're pivoting should borrow something from your mother brand. But if it just borrows and doesn't build something back, then you're going to be in trouble. And I think one of my favorite examples, and it's old enough, I'm not going to get in trouble for raising it, but when you think about the Bic brand, disposable razors, disposable lighters, they launched a windsurfer back when windsurfers were a trend. Now, I'm not sure who wants to buy a disposable windsurfer, but my favorite example of, hey, there's a trend, I'm going to take my brand and jump on that.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. It's a reminder of something that, bugging a little bit of academia here, the Europeans and the Canadians were ahead of the Americans on, because for a long time, the Americans thought brands were specific products.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Procter & Gamble for years, Crest was only a toothpaste, or Tide was only a detergent. A brand is a promise. And if your promise can expand to new areas and that core, then you've got the opportunity to do it. I agree with the comment about how costly it is to build a new one. From Kamal, as we move into the recession, oh dear, I guess we are, and online, and once the discretionary spending reduces in terms of the needs versus wants, do you think you'll be more driven by price sensitivity or brand equity? Tricky one.
It kind of goes back to what we had talked about earlier. If you've got that brand equity, you know what it is, do not stop investing in it. As the point Ian just made, it takes a long time to build a brand. So to suddenly just say, well, look, I'm going to become the value or the discount option. Our good friend Ken Wong has a wonderful expression: margin sucking maggots.
Yes.
Look, I can turn around and triple my sales by reducing my price by 40%, and I make no money. So I mean, you've got to take that equity that you've got and be sensitive to the pricing. The elasticity is likely going to stretch a little bit given the economic times, but don't think that the only way to play is to lower your price. I think that's just irresponsible as a brand manager.
I also think that too often when people talk about value, they automatically go to price.
Yay!
Anybody who buys a brand, anytime you buy a brand, people who buy Porsches think they're getting great value. And that's not about price. It's about the value equation of a brand, which is a combination of what you're getting from the product, the brand, and the price that you pay for that. And I think it is true. It's very easy to take price down. It is very challenging for brands to actually reposition themselves up. I think one of my favorite examples is North Face used to be the preeminent outdoor clothing company, in my opinion, for years. And then all of a sudden, as they chased volume, they started bringing the price down. Perceptions of the brand went down, points of distribution, types of points of distribution, and it really changed the perception of the brand over time. So I think understanding the true, what value means to your consumer over and above just what the price is important.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd add one last comment, Alan, and it comes, and Ian, I'm sure can attest as well from my experience in a range of different product categories. Once you start taking your price down, you will have a very, very difficult time taking it back up. So it's a bit of a one-way journey, and it's not one that a brand that delivers on unmet needs, does a good job of it, has that value opportunity being a premium that Ian just talked about. Don't start with pricing because you'll never return.
Mm-hmm. Another question here from Radican. We touched on it earlier, but it's more specific. He's saying, what is the relevance and value you and your organization as marketers place on market research during this new normal? What kind of research would you pay most attention to? Now, you talked a little bit about it, about not reacting too quickly, but we do need some tracking out there of what's going on. Where are you going to look?
Well, it kind of goes back as well to what we said. Don't jump to conclusions, and don't look to the past for an answer to our future. So tracking, by all means. I mean, that to me is a management report card that allows you to make real-time decisions. I'm talking about asking different types of questions, understanding really what has changed in that consumer that you're targeting, and why. And that emotional quotient is a very tough thing to understand, because as we found, as we built a few research tools ourselves, people can't articulate emotion.
Right.
So if you just take the one or two kind of answers that come out of their mouth and you go off and spend $1 million against that, chances are you'll come up a bit short. So doing different types of research that ask different questions, and I do believe, given the emotional impact of what we're all going through, that is a very, very fertile area to be asking new questions in.
Ian?
Yeah, I think one of the critical pieces I think you need to think about when you're looking at research is everybody has the same research. Everybody is asking the same questions. Everybody wants to know what the consumer's doing. And I think the brands that are really successful are the ones that can interpret that and gain some insight from it, and not just be lazy and look at casual observational research behavior. So I think the critical piece is doing some work and understanding what are the implications of what I'm seeing. And then to David's point, testing what does that hypothesis look like from a consumer perspective, and having a conversation with your consumers about the relevance of that to them. Because, it does, everybody's seen those reports. Everybody's doing a report about post-COVID consumer. They are disturbingly similar.
Yep.
So how do you take that and action that in a way that's going to help build your business in a unique way?
It's interesting. We're coming from an intensive analytics movement where everything was about data and analytics. The thing about data and analytics in consumer and business behavior is it tries to pick up trends. Well, we've now just had a massive disturbance of those trends. So I'm going to add in a thought for personal bias, because that's how I did my PhD. A lot of people should be following their customers in their lives and seeing how they're responding in this environment, and as the environment goes out, actually observing through ethnography, through observation, how people are actually behaving. So, for instance, one of the things, and I'll fess up, I'm a loyal Loblaw shopper. So I stop in my local Loblaws and watch how people are deciding at different shelves and then how they line up to go out and what they go back in and get while they're in the lineup. And I've been asking a couple of people, don't tell my local store manager that, but what they're doing. And it's interesting because it's about the experimentation, but the theme is get to know your customer in the new environment, not necessarily project forward old patterns. Thoughts?
Well, to that point, Al, I mean, think about it. 3 months ago, who would have thought that safety, cleanliness, a risk-free shopping environment would have been potentially in the top 10 drivers for your grocery store pick? I mean, it was all about food and nutrition and quality and variety and value, and it was a wonderful experience. Well, the world has changed, and that's why one of the things that I believe brand owners have to keep investing. And I know that's sometimes a hard sell with your CFO when you're in the midst of the kind of world that we're living in. But that's why you have to show and you think of your brand as an asset. It has value. Without that value, you risk running into a lot of the problems that we've talked about on this call. But if you don't keep investing, then that equity begins to erode. And one of the important things that our previous, whoever asked the question, we have to invest in understanding those new unmet needs. A grocery store that's still playing by 3 months ago and not changing that shopping environment, I think we all know they'll probably end up at the bottom of the heap.
Yeah. I'm going to bug in the last question, then I'm going to ask you to do a summary as we approach the end of our time. What we haven't talked about yet is the role of people in this, and particularly people at the front line. And being that we have a retailer online, and a lot of our economy is service oriented. And I want to link back to something John Doig from Scotia said, which is of the 5 banks, they were the one who decided to keep all their branches open so they could continue the relationship between their employees and the people in the branches and their customers. Can you talk a little bit, because my suspicion is in all service sectors, the role of the frontline employee and the manager of those frontline employees is going to be more and more important in delivering the trust value for the brand. How would you respond to that?
I think that this whole experience has shifted people's perception of those frontline workers, that outside of healthcare workers, and that there is tremendous value. And 6 weeks or 2 months ago, would we have been talking about essential workers in retail? And the answer probably would be no. So I think there is going to be reevaluation of how we see those people and how we treat those people. And I think that my personal opinion is that may sort of settle into society as a whole. I mean, I think back to the 2003 blackout in Ontario and Quebec. Yeah. And, we were only in isolation for 3 days without power, but we came out of there with an unbelievable sense of community. We came out with a greater sense of local. We came out with a greater sense of what it's like to actually sit down with your family and have a meal together. And those were all some incredible changes that we've seen as a result of a 3-day blackout. And so when I think about how we're going to emerge from this, which has been significantly longer lasting, I think perceptions of different parts of society will have changed. And I think the real question will be which ones are enduring and which ones are passing.
David, thoughts about staffing in the service sector?
Yeah, and well, I would actually, Alan, extend it beyond the service sector. Okay. I think this is something that potentially envelops everybody because of the enormity of what we said, this change we're going through. I think over the next year, 2, 3, 4, who knows, maybe forever, great brands are going to understand that they have a job to do that is as important around supporting versus selling. And I think we've come from a selling world where frontline staff, I go to Ian's world, they were transactional. They filled the shelves, they told you where to find the ketchup, and then they checked you out. Well, very transactional. I think in a world where people, for those emotional drivers that I talked about that are changing, people want to feel supported. It's a human requirement, right? They don't want to just be sold to. And I think as a result, the role of purpose, what's the purpose of this brand and the organization and its values that it lives by and through, will be just that much more important. So those frontline staff, anybody that has any type of B2B, B2C, an interaction with that consumer or that customer, has to play and understand that purpose so that they can support, not just sell.
Especially after lots of videos, we get to know people's family because often they pop up on the videos from home. So your kids are being very well behaved. Ian, some last thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to say, absolutely. As you move from transactional to a purpose-driven brand, we know for a fact that brands that are purpose-driven have higher levels of trust with the consumer. And so to tie it back to where we started, you know, building trust is an intangible thing until you run into a pandemic. And then it becomes probably the most invaluable thing that your brand actually has.
Thanks, Ian.
Which is why it's a glass half full, not a glass half empty right now.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm going to hand it back to Robert to close the session. But from me, a big thank you. Robert, on you come.
Thank you, Alan. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's session. We look forward to seeing you at the next session, which is going to be on May 21st at 2 p.m. with Lisa Conway, Executive Vice President of Invest Hotels, the largest hotel owner in Canada. Lisa will discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the hotel business, as well talk about leadership lessons from the boardroom. Again, thank you for attending today's Fireside Chat, and a special thanks to David, Ian, and Alan. Have a great afternoon.
Big thank you to David and Ian. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.